Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. My name is Grace Law, and I'm chair of the Department of Architecture here at Harvard GSD. Positions is a series of conversations convened by our department, and it's aimed at revealing the positions taken by players on the field of contemporary architecture. The series hopes to unfold the complexity of relations and metaphors to make them explicit, inviting faculty and guests to voice where they stand. So today, we're really very delighted to welcome Ryan Neiheiser and Tilo Herlach. Ryan, together with his partner Christina Argios, is teaching an option studio this semester entitled Pool Time, Collective Equipment for Living. He is a co-founder and director of his firm with Christina, Neiheiser Argios, which is a multidisciplinary architecture practices with offices in London and Athens. The practice works at many scales, including buildings, master plans, interiors, landscapes, exhibitions, and furniture. The studio's interests really are not defined by a particular project type, but rather a commitment to cultural resonance. So the firm has ongoing projects currently right now in the UK, Europe, and in the United States. Ryan has worked for a number of prestigious architecture practices in the Europe and the US, including the Office of Metropolitan Architecture in Rotterdam and Diller Scofidio in New York City. He's taught thesis at Princeton University and has been teaching a design studio at the Architectural Association in London since 2014. Ryan is a co-founder of the architecture publication Another Pamphlet, was a co-editor of the book Agenda, Can We Sustain Our Ability to Crisis, published by ACTAR, and has published articles in Project, Do, New Geographies, and Pigeon, among others. Ryan is originally from Cleveland, Ohio, and has lived in Rotterdam, Brussels, and New York prior to moving to London in 2014. Ryan received his MArch in 2008 from Princeton, and that was after earning a dual bachelor's degree in engineering and art from Swarthmore College. So we also have with Ryan Tilo Herlach, who is a principal and founding partner of the Swiss architecture firm HHF Architects based in Basel. HHF Architects was founded in 2003 by Tilo, Simon Hartman, and Simon Frauenweiler. Together, they are teaching an option studio this fall entitled After the Campus, Verticalizing Basel. Their practice has realized numerous projects in Switzerland, Germany, China, France, Mexico, and the US. The scope of work ranges from urbanism and large-scale construction to public pavilions and interior design, as well as collaborations with other architects and artists such as Ai Weiwei. More. HHF has been honored with numerous national and international awards and invited to several international biennales, including the Bi-City Shenzhen Hong Kong Biennial, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Venice Architecture Biennale, and the Chicago Architecture Biennale in 2017. Their work is part of the permanent collections of the Centre Pompidou in Paris, the Architecture Museum of TU Munich, and the Heinz Architecture Center at the Carnegie Museum of Art in Pittsburgh, among others. And Tilo has taught at the University of Innsbruck as well as at the Ohrid Summer Academy and has lectured at the ETH Zurich and many other universities. Tilo studied architecture at the ETH Zurich and at ETH Lausanne and is a member of the Board for Urban Planning and Architecture in Basel. Thank you very much. Too many B words. Please join me in welcoming Ryan and Tilo.
Thank you very much for inviting us to have a discussion about our positions. So I first thought, of course, do we have a position as an office? And I must say we do not have, because we are like three so different characters that we have a common interest, and now since 20 years we have a common past. So it's a lot about experience we did and learning from that experience. But when we founded the office, we even did not know each other very well, and we had kind of different, we were on different schools, we had very different professors. So I started with Marc Argelil, Simon Frommenwiller, he was with Hans Kohlhoff, so it was really kind of the opposite. So first thing we did when we started to work together was to find out common interest and common focus point. And we didn't have certain points in the past where we could say this is like an origin for the office, but we were always interested in collaboration and discussing on projects. And when we had a first bigger housing project, we searched for things we know in Basel, and we found Rudolf Linder, which is not a very well-known architect, maybe outside of Basel, but he did a lot of important buildings in Basel, especially in housing, and he was also kind of the starting point for other architects like Hans Bernoulli, who then went very famous. Hans Bernoulli was like the design chief in his office, like in a later stadium. And Rudolf Linder, he was not only an architect, he was also a building contractor, so he built his houses himself, and he was a developer for housing projects. And what intrigued us, now I see, I was just not sure if it is coordinated, was intrigued us that in his apartment buildings, the representation was always something very important. So even if there was just a lot of apartments, they had a representation which was bigger than the sum of its parts. So it was also always about the communal aspect and that the community is bigger than the individual in itself. He was also he was the first one introducing concrete construction in Basel. So he worked with the system Ennebic, and this was also part of that. He could build kind of cheaper and better, with better conditions than with the traditions. On the other hand, he had very special feeling and abilities to work with space, and he just drawn floor plans which are really inspiring for us to think about space and architecture. Also, in terms of representation, he worked with these kind of axonometric views, which showed for us a representation we did not know at that time. But the project I would like to mention first is his last work in Basel, which is called Etagenhäuser am Viadukt. So it's apartment housing in Basel. And the special thing about it is that, I'll go back. It's quite large apartments, and he introduced kind of the maisonette apartment to the housing project in Basel. So if you see that in the section, there is 2 floors, ground floor and a garden floor, and then there are 2 apartments in the middle, which is just on a floor, and then again a penthouse with a maisonette. The apartments are really big and with a depth of the building of 20 meters, which is incredibly deep. And so he introduced this light wells in the middle to have light in the middle of the building. And the other thing is that the apartments are so big that they also have like several entries, and it's possible to split up or to split certain parts of the apartment from the rest. So there is kind of 2 apartments in one, and altogether then it's got the sum of that, it's kind of a possibility of combinations which is kind of really extraordinary. The apartments, like, they were so big that today the maisonette is just rented as 1 flat per floor, because like just no one can pay the rent for that. These are some impressions of the interior. This is like the garden floor with the stair coming down from the floor with the big holes. And when we then started with I tried to make kind of an overview of projects with all the influences. And one of like the first points we started was a project Lichtstraße, which was it's a housing project with a restaurant in the ground floor. And this was also a family-owned plot, and it consists of 4 apartments, 4 houses, 4 entrances, and one of these buildings was like at the end of his time, so we had to replace it. And one old building we kept as it is, and the corner building we refurbished and integrated into the new project. And what we did is that we combined 3 of these old houses into 1 staircase, and the staircase is kind of in the old courtyard of the 3 houses. So inside you can still see the old facade, because like the windows are just like now covered with fireproof glass, and you go along the old facade to the top. The corner building is kind of the old one, and then there is like a new part. This is the yellow one, and one is a combination between new and old in one. And the idea was to have apartments which could fit as apartments you rent, which are not too big, or you could combine like the whole corner to one big apartment, which is kind of comparable to the project of Rudolf Linder. So like the red one is about 65 square meters, 2-room apartment. The brighter red one is 130, I think. No, 106 square meters, which is kind of fine for a 4-room or 3-room. And in the combination, it's like a really big apartment. But this also gave the opportunity to have like different storytellings in between, like how you use these apartments, and that's I will show later. When you enter at the corner where you're already like on your outdoor space, more or less. So one of these loggias is part of the entry area, and you turn. You have a view to the park, and with the floor plan, we tried always to create niches. So it's a completely open floor plan with niches, and in all these niches you could have different functions like rooms or kitchen or living area, and so like it's possible to have the kitchen on 3 different positions, because like all the ducts are already there, they are foreseen, and you can choose where you have what. And then we have like this enfilade of rooms in the service part of this new part. Then this is now a view to the old and new, where you have like on the left side it's kind of the original substance, and like then extended with a new building, with also like where the materials are then like clearly coming from our time. Now, if you go through the apartments, floor by floor, they were now it's a condominium, so they sold them, and in the first floor, it was the situation that like a couple with their old mother. They moved in and they wanted to have kind of two apartments. So one is for the mother and the other one is where they live. So the mother lives in the old part and they live in the new part, and there is just like one separation wall you could take off, and then you have a new the hole or whatever. In the second floor, the situation was that someone was kind of reducing. Their children went out, and they had a really big house, so they just reduced to 170 square meters for themselves. So she was a designer for clothes. So this is kind of now the situation where you really have like this really big bourgeois apartment with one like living area, which is really big, and then kind of cut off because it's like in the back of the entrance, your private spaces with the bedrooms and bathroom and their office space where they could design. These are our impressions for how it is in that apartment with this combination. And this is looking from the old part to the new one through the entrance. This is now their view towards the park with the big living area, and then like kitchen and dining area, which is kind of really spacious. Then next floor, it was a family with 3 children, and they divided in a way that they have kind of one part for the parents, which is in the new in the new part of the building, with their own bedroom, own bathroom, living, dining, and then kind of cut off with a separated entrance also, like the part for the children. So when they get older and not want to be under the control of the parents, they can kind of sneak in and out of their apartment. Completely also then different now the position of the kitchen again and material. So it was also like to have like one thing which is the whole, but individuality, but you share things, and so it's more than just like everyone has his individual part. It's also kind of a shared idea of the whole project. Then this is the last floor, which is kind of different from the others because there is like a maisonette apartment in the new part. So it's kind of cut horizontal. So like the old corner building, which is just like refurbished, was extended by the new part on the, what is this, right side, right side. And then there is like on 2 stories, like in the new part building where you have like the day rooms on the first level, and then the second level, it's the bedrooms and a big terrace on the roof. This is now then the old building where, again, like this, the depth of the building was a topic with this enfilade. This is now the entrance space to the, like from the living to the rooms. On the left side, you have the kitchen. Then another kind of enfilade in the bedrooms. And then the view from the living area towards the courtyard. And the other, and also like from material-wise, then we kept what was there with like the wood and plaster. And the new part of the building, it's kind of really different with rough materials, so untreated concrete, just plain wood, kind of really direct. So this is now the entrance situation you have. You come into your apartment, and it's kind of like being in your yard, in your outdoor space, like you have a situation you have in a house. And the kitchen that time is it's on the courtyard side, and yeah. Oh, I'm already through. So I'm hand over.
All right. Can you hear me? Okay. All right. Well, thanks, Grace, and thanks, Tilo, for agreeing to do this with me. We'll have to get the rhythm down here of going back and forth. All right, positions. What is our position? Another way of saying maybe what should we do? This is what we ask ourselves every time we confront a new design challenge. It's also what Bruno Latour asks in his book Down to Earth, a book I'm sure you're familiar with. His answer is, first of all, generate alternate descriptions. existing as a people, and being able to describe one's dwelling place is one and the same thing. For us, this is the most compelling aspect of Latour's work, his challenge to us all to be better, more carefully observed, but also more imaginative cartographers. Artists, architects, writers, philosophers, scientists, and politicians, we must all, first and foremost, generate alternate descriptions of our surroundings, of the earth that lies directly beneath our feet. So for us, architecture can be understood as the crafting of alternate descriptions. We believe that in order to move forward, in order to progress, to improve, we need different ways of seeing what is already right in front of us. Whereas modernism and its contemporary incarnations obsess with the future, we think that the present and the past deserve just as much of our attention. We think of design as an act of radical reuse of materials, yes, but also geometries, narratives, habits, and atmospheres, a kind of deep survey and remapping of the systems that surround us, a reframing of what has been in front of us all along. The Asterisms project by the artist Gabriel Orozco shows the power of collecting, of simply looking around, gathering, and trying to make sense of the things that surround us. In our office, we treat every project as a kind of adaptive reuse project. Not only are we looking closely at how to reuse an existing building or site, but we're also constantly gathering objects, ideas, texts, and forms, and reusing them in new ways. It guides the way we organize and reflect on our own work, where we're always trying to make sense of our past and current projects according to location, time, size, and shape. Today I'll share 6 projects with you, 1 in Venice, 2 in London, and 3 in Greece, all realized, each different attempts at generating alternate descriptions. The first project is a kind of projective atlas that we developed as the curators of the Greek Pavilion at the Venice Biennale back in 2018. The premise there was, although we typically think of learning taking place in the classroom, educators and architects have recognized for thousands of years that learning also takes place in the space between, in the hallways, stairs, at the cafe, in the quad. Our project considered these academic common spaces as architectural specimens, objectively identified, classified, and made legible for analysis. It was a typological analysis, but it was also a simple collecting of things that we liked, of a kind of institutional architecture that Christine and I were really interested in. Raphael's fresco, The School of Athens, guided our thinking. It offers a utopian vision of a free, open, informal, and common space for learning. But it is not a classroom. And yet we see scholars and students debating, teaching, and studying. But most of the analysis of this image has been on the scholars that inhabit the foreground. We wanted to look at the architecture of the informal learning. Here we see an in-between space, neither inside nor outside, not quite a room, but also not simply a space for circulation. Our design for the pavilion, this is the Greek pavilion in the Giardini, our design formed its own kind of learning common space or free space, which was the theme of the Biennale that year. By self-consciously adopting the architectural trope, possibly cliche, of the amphitheater, the space is constructed as a stepped landscape. The field of 3D printed models, we generated 60 models of different academic common spaces from around the world. These 3D printed models were displayed across this landscape, inviting visitors to move throughout the pavilion and putting the object and people in direct dialogue with one another. We looked at academic examples from throughout time and around the world, some built, some unbuilt. Working on the Greek pavilion, we looked at kind of 2 canonical examples from Athens itself. This is Plato's Academy, or a kind of imagined design of the courtyard of Plato's Academy. And this is the Theater of Dionysus. And these 2 form, in some ways, a kind of origin that we kind of continue to repeat today of academic common spaces, the courtyard and the amphitheater space. We looked at other unrealized projects, Boulet's National Library, Cedric Price's Fun Palace, also a kind of education space, and then more contemporary examples, Sana's Rolex Center, an institution I know well, this is the AA, where the stoop in front of 36 Bedford and the bar, and then the long corridor connecting all of the diploma units at the top form the from the commons. In our opinion, this was a subjective analysis, obviously, and we left out all of the other aspects of the architecture. We're here down the road. This is MIT's Infinite Corridor, where we didn't model all of the rooms on each side of the corridor, but just the sectional quality of that kind of infinite space as a meeting space. Or here in Gund Hall, where we leave out all of the offices and classrooms, and even the lobby, but look at the trays as the main common space of the building. And then a few views of the built pavilion. In the context of the information overload of the Biennale, we deliberately removed all information except for the models that were on display. So the walls were white. An image of the opening outside the Greek pavilion. And one of the series of events and symposiums that we hosted in the space throughout the 6 months that the pavilion was open, here with different architects presenting projects that they had in the show, in the kind of commons of this new learning space. Because we chose not to have any wall text, all information was kind of optional to visitors, but available in the form of a series of pamphlets that we designed. 3 different pamphlets, one which contained drawings, one was text-based data, and one was images. So the project is about collecting and revealing overlooked aspects of often well-known projects, looking closely and modeling, drawing, photographing, and then sorting, organizing, and presenting. In this way, we provide an alternate description of what already exists, but in a way that encourages us to reuse past and present ideas in new contexts and combinations towards designing an academic commons of the future. All right, second project. Second project is a literal adaptive reuse project, trying to bring back life to a tired and abandoned 6-story office building in the suburbs of Athens. This is in a neighborhood called Marousi. The existing building was just about as ugly as we could imagine. This is it, seen from 4 views. It really had no discernible logic in its organization or form. It had been added on to a few times. It was more chaotic than we were used to dealing with in our own kind of impulses for design. And it was a developer-based project that they wanted to turn it into an office building. We couldn't remove or add anything, given the kind of limitations of the site. And if we demolished anything, it would not be allowed to be rebuilt. So we were stuck with this monster. A breakthrough came when we began to accept its kind of obscene form and embrace it as a kind of surreally beautiful monster made of radically different logics that had been crudely combined, similar to the surrealist or Dada exquisite corpse constructions. We tried to embrace this weirdness and tried to reveal the building's true self more fully, finding the unique forms within the mess and working to describe each of them as unique elements and make them more legible. With the surreal power of something like a Morandi painting, awkward and ambiguous volumes in dialogue with one another, the building becomes a literal sum of its parts, with each part given individual legibility. So from this, we revealed this. We like the scalelessness of it, something like a small city, a pile of blocks, or a building all at once. The front elevation is more neutral, but still a collection of different finishes for each volume. A clear and legible entrance reestablished. The roof offers a new landscaped space for work and leisure under the shade of a new pergola, with views across the city. Athens itself is a kind of a surreal, exquisite corpse. At the interior, we stripped back the foam formwork to reveal the original structural coffers and added a series of distinctive objects to organize this internal workspace. Bookshelves, hot desking tables, an event amphitheater at the ground level, the entry lobby desk, and a stair connecting to the mezzanine. The project tries hard to give an alternate description to what already existed, exaggerating and amplifying the unique character of each building geometry, revealing a clearer sense of the original building's underlying DNA.
Thank you. We always try to learn from things we already built. So now step forward from Lichtstraße, which was kind of really big apartment. Now we try to densify certain ideas of that, so that it can reduce by 50%. The next project I want to show is Bifangweg. It's also in Basel. There was an old villa built for one family. When we kind of were commissioned with this project, it was kind of divided in 3 apartments, but these apartments, they shared the staircase as a communal corridor, so it was not really apartments, it was just like living together under one roof. But they had like what kind of interesting aspects. And again, remembering Lindl, that a house is not only like the visibility of certain parts, but it's also a thing as a whole. A representation is something as a whole. We try to make now 4 apartments, but the expression on the outside, it's just like one villa, which is just like one unit, and you cannot really recognize where which apartment is. And this was kind of the driving motor. One important thing is that it's right on the sidewalk, so you cannot have, and it's only apartments, so you cannot have an apartment like on the ground floor. So this is why it has this split level. So there is like one entrance floor, and then like the bedrooms of the ground floor are already in the first floor, and like the ground floor of the apartment with the garden is kind of half a floor up the street. So it's also like under one roof, so it's like 4 apartments with all like completely different conditions, and kind of not built like exactly on the firewall to the next building, but like leaving a gap so that it really kind of this house is kind of self-standing and only connected through their outdoor space to the next building. The idea of having like the possibility to shrink or being bigger in an apartment, like in Lichtstraße, where you have like 2 apartments combined to one, we condensed to 1 apartment. So like the darker part of Bifangweg is kind of this half-story higher than the main floor, with 2 bedrooms. But this was also then allowing, because like these 2 bedrooms, they have their own bathroom, they have their own entrance, they have their own elevator. It could be like a mini unit for someone to live, or just like a second entrance to the apartment. The structures were simple, so it's just like the facade, a load-bearing system, and the core itself. And on the other hand, it's very deep. The depth of the building is 14 meters, and in all the rooms they have direct daylight, but like in the situation where you have the kitchen, it's so deep that we introduced or kept the existing light well, to have light in the middle of the building, and this just like formed a very special condition for the space. Now, just like the different possibilities, what I've shown here is kind of the standard apartment, like with a big living area towards the garden, dining towards the street, and 3 bedrooms. But you could also add 1 bedroom more, or an office space, so then you have a 6-room apartment with 2 entrances, or then on the left side, on the right side, like an accessory the dwelling unit, like with the idea if maybe you have a family, they grow, then the children move out, and maybe you get old and someone has to take care of you. So you could even have someone like living in your apartment. You close off with a door. It's maybe difficult to see, but like where this internal stairs, there is like a door. You could add a kitchen because the ducts are already there. So this apartment could be adapted during kind of a lifetime to different situations very easily, and it's not just that we fix as architects, or we define everything as architects. What we try to do is like giving like a score in music, something that people can take over. They can change and just like adapt to their needs. Section is clear. Then just going through these different apartments, again, like the idea of Rudolf Linder, that everything maybe can be completely different from something else, but very specific. We tried to have like 3 different, very specific conditions for apartments. So there is like one apartment in the ground floor. This has its own entrance from the outside, like it's not using the staircase. It has an own yard, and the garden is their garden. So it's like a family home, you know, with no neighbors. They're just like on top of you. The ground floor is very high. It's about 3 meters. So, and you already see here now in the background this light well with the kitchen. There is like a lot of light coming in, even like in the middle of the apartment. So even if it's like one side is kind of closed off, it's bright all around the floor plan. The kitchen, now looking to the yard, and then again as enfilade, like looking to your own garden. Then the next 2 floors, they are kind of similar. It's just like with one room less. This is kind of a typical apartment with these 2 levels. You could kind of differentiate according to your needs. The 3rd level is kind of the same. This is now kind of spacious situation with windows all around and like big living area. The kitchen in the middle, which is kind of a very special space, serving to 2 sides, so one to the street. And on both sides there is like a balcony, so you could also you could switch from one side to the other with your dining room according to your needs. The windows you can open there, like swing windows. This is now the situation to the street side. Then this is how you get to the next level with this half floor, and the view from the half floor to the garden. Then on top, I mean, it must also say, I mean, here we try to do the maximum possible ever. So there is like no square meter you could build more on than plot. It's just like filled, and maybe it's also overdone. But I mean, it was interesting to do it once. So the roof is then completely different. It's a pitched roof and has kind of no windows to the outside. So in the facade, everything is just like within the roof. It's just like only roof. Everything is just like under this pitched roof, which is also like very specific for like this one apartment. So someone who likes to live under a roof. This is then kind of on 2 floors. You enter like in one of the floors with the apartments, go up 1 floor, and then you have one situation with a living, dining, and then a bedroom. Half a floor up, there is like an office space, and then again, half a floor up, there is bathrooms and a master bedroom. So everything is kind of under this roof. Also the windows, they are not kind of standard windows to the facade. It's kind of this atelier situation with these windows. You can also look to the sky. And then again, this situation to this firewall. Like this firewall really had to defend. Like no one thought that this would ever be possible. And when like people bought the apartment, they said, "Yeah, but first thing we do, we close that window because we will not look towards the wall." But at the end, like they were so happy with it, they all left. And I mean, again, learning from one project to the next one, if we would not have built this situation with this firewall, it's like 1 meter in front of you, we would not be able then also to think like in a very other dense area to develop a project, a housing project in Basel, like in a courtyard, which was very dense, and really kind of surrounded by walls. Before it was a parking space, and then we were asked to develop a housing project, and so we figured out to propose kind of a pyramid where the apartments in the ground floor or in the lower floors, they are just like dealing with these firewalls, and when you come up, it's just like you have the view, and apartments are maybe more conventional than the other ones. Here you see like the first 2 floors that really like surrounded by walls, and this became a topic to kind of produce courtyards kept by walls and the building itself, and really like very special situations which are very calm, like in the city. So it's really like another world when you just enter your apartment and you have kind of a courtyard which is kind of blending out the whole city. And it really works quite well with, even if the walls are so close, it's astonishingly. And again, it's kind of step by step. We try to do something, and then maybe one part of a project has an influence on the next one, and so it's just like going on. It's always like learning by doing, and having an experience also to have a kind of a reason to do something.
Tempted to try and find some sort of segue into my... anyways, this is the 3rd project, I'm sure. It's located in London on the North Greenwich Peninsula, East London, just across from Canary Wharf. It's adjacent to the O2 Arena, that big gray circle on the screen. And we were commissioned to build a screen to hide this mess of infrastructure. The North Greenwich tube station is below the ground here, and all of the exhaust vents and fire stairs existed here, an inconvenience for the commercial ambitions of the developer for the surrounding area. But we saw this obstacle, this seemingly ugly mass, as an important part of the existing landscape, mysterious in function and ambiguous in shape, almost like an iceberg adrift in this new public space. And also like an iceberg in that it suggested just the tip of a much larger infrastructural system below. Our proposal was to wrap the tip of this iceberg in a form as ambiguous as the underlying object, and at the same time choose a material that would both hide and reveal the existing condition. Perhaps paradoxically, we used a very industrial material, corrugated aluminum sheet metal, to mask the industrial. The shape was partially informed by the site pressures and access requirements, which were extensive. We were interested in its potential as both an object and a screen that could be both solid and translucent. We developed a few key details to refine the overall appearance, taking this industrial material and shifting the perception of it by giving it an edge and a bit of refinement at its corners. Some photos of the construction. It was a fairly elaborate steel structure for what ended up being a kind of glorified screen, in a complicated set of foundations as well. The material responds quite dramatically to the changing lighting conditions, at times like glass or a silk curtain, and at other times completely opaque. Here both conditions at once, depending on the backdrop. A large media screen on one side announces upcoming shows at the O2 and digital creations by Ravensbourne students, which are next door, creating a spectacle at night from across the plaza. It's an object hidden in plain sight, both the object of the screen and the object of the industry on the inside of the industrial tubes. A kind of viewing device that provides an alternate description of the infrastructure beneath, obscuring but not hiding it from the public. 4th project I wanted to share is a very humble project that's currently under construction in London right now as well. It's called the Exeter Road Pavilion. It's an adaptive reuse of a Victorian garden outbuilding in a back garden of a private residential house. Kind of looks something like this. The brief was to create an interior cabinet to store books, records, and art, and an exterior canopy to shield from the rain. We created a single long cabinet that extends from inside to outside and supports the canopy. The alternate description in this case was something about gravity, a force we take for granted. Our intuition was that the canopy and the storage cabinet could be related, but a tension between them had to be created in order to hold them in relation. We were reminded of the work of Fischli and Weiss and their series of photographs that capture the precarious moment of balance just on the verge of collapse, a kind of provisional codependence. And so we created a simple canopy, but we described the path of gravity in a non-intuitive way. We intentionally disrupted a balanced state, created a precarity by removing a column, and then created a provisional order, a kind of alternative order with a counterbalance. It's an alternate description of the forces on the site, which we think amplifies the banal and makes something unexpected in the process. In its realized form, the counterweight, what was seen as the boulder before, is now a solid chunk of marble that has been milled to fit within the web of a galvanized I-beam at left. Here it's green. And the tension rod on the right is expressed. This is looking the other way. This is the stainless steel cabinet that both reflects the garden and reveals what's contained within. It's another perforated steel material, extending continuously from the inside to the outside. This is that tension rod at the back. And here you can see the marble, steel, and polycarbonate legibly stacked one on top of one another. Raw and refined, held closely together. And then the ever-changing garden made visible through the reflection.
Now it's kind of an experiment because I won't show catchy images. It's more I want to, to talk about evolution of a floor plan we are working on. So it's now we are like in this phase. Where does it lead to, or where are we now? And I would like to talk about housing, and again starting with Lichtstraße, like this situation where you enter your apartment, but in a way which is not like being in a corridor, but it's already like in a representative space, or it's kind of the yard you enter your house. And from that on, like this idea was kind of a driving thing through many of our floor plans, where we always try to have like the entrance not in the center of the apartment, but somewhere tangential, and then just like going into the apartment and discover part for part. In that series, I would like to start with a building we just finished in Biel, Switzerland, which was called Jardin Métropole, and which was inspired by the Volkshaus. This is for theater, and so also in Biel. And Biel has a very tradition of very beautiful modernistic buildings and town planning. Edward Lanz was one of the famous ones. Then Max Schluep, who built the Messezentrum, a conference hall with very crazy idea of combining a concert hall with a public swimming pool. So in the 60s, so really inspiring. And like one is like experience, and the other thing is inspiration for us. So we, of course, we get inspired maybe by our own projects and try to develop them more and more, but also like have inspiration from the site, from other people, from the history. And in that case, it was Edward Lanz. this is the situation you see. The project had to deal with very different urban conditions. So on one side you had an old village with the church, a lot of green, two-story housing, and the other side you had like housing blocks from the 60s, like 20, 25 meters high, and a very normal European street with a normal scale, we just like know in our cities. So this led then to a volume which is kind of rotating and having like a very low part towards like the old village, and then just like growing until you have like the tower, which is exactly in the axis to the highway. Like whenever you go to Biel and you come from the highway, just like you're facing exactly that spot. So it's also like a landmark, but the landmark which is then like kind of trying to fill in like the urban tissue. And it was a competition before, and it was not only for the building, but it's also for a new park there. And this led then to the idea of having a jardin métropole, which is like an urban garden, so that this building is part of this park and is also like a green surface. With terraces, and on these terraces you have like urban gardening. This is a communal space for the people living in the tower, and also, of course, then for integration, like the rain, just to keep back the rain from the canalization system, so that everything is kind of greener than before. This is now like situation you see how it's embedded in the in this park situation. And now that the floor plan, it was kind of a translation of this entrance space where you, like in the tower, it's a very, I mean, it's not a high-rise building, and it's a very small building, so it's just like one unit per floor in the tower. But like the volumetry looks much bigger than it is, and like with this staircase like on one corner, which is kind of exceptional and not very efficient for a floor plan. We also like introduced this like entering through the outdoor space, and then here you have the situation on one hand you have like the more public spaces, or you turn to the other side and you have you're all at the private rooms, and there is like a connection then at the end, so that you can really like walk around the whole floor plan. The ground floor, it's an open space like with this rotonde, which is like referencing to this what is this, a Kreisel, like where the cars drive, a roundabout, yes, a roundabout, and then with a coffee. And then here you see like the building towards the street is just the height of the street, also like defining then the size of the street. In the first floor, because of like this volumetry, it's extremely deep. The floor plan is like about 20 meters, and you have situations with like this one like in the middle on top, one apartment which has a depth of 10 meters to the core. But also like this worked quite well with this kind of opening in this Alvar Aalto style, and defining the space with a column between the dining area and the living area. Then you go up, you have like a first communal garden with urban gardening. This is shared for all the apartments in this house. Up again, next terrace, and then kind of this situation with the tower, and this entrance where you already have like your outer space in the entrance, and the niche which is defining the entrance space. And then on top, again, like the roof garden. Another aspect of it, it was not only about the garden. The facade is a photovoltaic facade, but we tried to integrate it in a way that it doesn't look technical, but it just like appears as a very normal building, with materials you know. And their inspiration was like the Fachelhaus von Max Schluep, with a curtain wall. And we introduced like these photovoltaic elements in the curtain wall, always in between the windows. And then there is like this ceramic tiles as ribbons going around the building, alternated by the photovoltaic. And again in Biel, it was for a collective housing competition, where everything had to be, again, very dense. And then coming from this Jardin Métropole, we tried to make a linear system out of that, with apartments like on both sides of the staircase, and worked with a grid by 4 by 4 meters. So it's like neutral spaces. You can have a living area within that grid, or the rooms. And the idea was to have a timber system for the roof, but always like with the identical span of 4 meters, but like differentiation of the vectors of the load bearing. So you could have integrate like all the ducts in the ceiling, and only have like a suspended ceiling in the bathroom, where you have the vertical shaft, and from there on you could achieve all the rooms. Then again, denser and bigger competition for something in Zetalplatz, a very noisy area, where we tried to make a kind of a very kind of closed-off courtyard with inside and a sequence of streets and courtyards. So with kind of gates towards from the noisy street gates to these streets where the people living, and they should be very lively with the entrances and the balconies. And on the other side, then it's like the more private area. Then again, like the transition from this Fleur de la Champagne typology, where we had like 4 meters of span, but then this needs a lot of facade. So every room has 4 meters in the facade, but we had to have much more density. So we squeezed like the whole grid from 4 by 4 meter to 3.25 to 5 meters. So we have like much more windows along the facade, and everything just like getting deeper. And then again, with this idea, we had like 2 typologies, because there was a condominium and collective housing, and we tried to have kind of the same floor plan with a different depth of the building and different depth of the entrance balconies, so that you could offer once condominiums which you enter directly to your apartment. You have your own balcony, everything is very private, and the collective housing, where like you have shared spaces, so you enter through the balcony to your apartment. It's again this situation of having like coming through your garden to your apartment in a certain floor. This would be the situation for this collective housing with the entrances, and here like this the density of that building. We also introduced kind of bowed windows in the courtyards, because they were very narrow, so that you don't have like an opposite or directly a view towards your direct neighbor on the other side of the courtyard, but you always have to look into the original, so you kind of you extend the factor of distance to your neighbor. This is an impression of this courtyard. And then where we are now, a building near Basel with a school building. This is the one with the tower and a gym, and then a housing along a small creek. And this housing has like very different sizes of apartments. So on one hand, like they have like tiny homes. You have row housing, and you have like family apartments, which I want to show you. This is now an impression of these tiny homes. It's a width of 4 meters, and always like one room in the front and one in the back, and the front one is you enter also like through a shared terrace, and the other one is then the private space. In a courtyard, which is also quite dense, and there is again these apartments for families, and then coming from Seetalplatz, like with like that experience, we tried to make the most compact apartments ever, where also like the staircase is not inside, so you can reduce surface you have to heat, so that we tried to have only heated, which is really serving the apartment, and everything else is on the outside. And again, now here you have a situation where you enter through your balcony, through your garden to the apartment, and then inside the apartment you have like an entrance, and then the living and dining, and also like this walk around that you can have a circuit inside the apartment. So it was like step by step densifying a spacious situation, but not losing like a quality we thought it's really important for the apartment. View from the inside, then again the outside with this terracing, and to show some catchy images at the end, because I don't want to finish with that one. There is one project now, not like with this the topologies of the floor plan, but another influence we had for Starlet in Strasbourg, where we kind of worked with this stepping down. So like, again, an influence from one project went to another one. This is just built, and it's I just wanted to show there like this with the stepping, and that like one experience from one project goes always to the next one.
All right, thanks. We doing okay here, Grace? I'll try to be fast with it. Okay.
Just want to leave some time for questions.
Yeah, yep. Okay, two more quick projects. Double take. This is the St. Minas house. This is a house outside of Athens, about an hour north of Athens, on a very beautiful seaside site. It was an existing structure that had been built back in the 60s, late 60s, early 70s, a really beautiful kind of concrete the arches were original to the structure. It had been sitting abandoned for more than 10 years when we came on the scene. It was in significant disrepair, cracked. The arches had sort of sheared. There was a lot of rust. The original house had just been the central portion, and so our project is a full gut renovation of the central portion, and then an extension of two wings on either side of the house. We started to think about it as a kind of a collage between new and old that forces a kind of a double take, where at times there's a seamlessness between old and new, but at other times it's clearly distinct what is original and what is the kind of fresh new addition to the project. It's a very much a two-sided house. The top elevation is the elevation that faces the sea. The bottom elevation is the one that faces the forest behind. This is our proposal, so it has the side wings already extending off of it. And this is it built. This is the approach from the forest, where it's just a one-story building, and then when you get to the seaside, it becomes a two-story building that steps down and embraces a large garden overlooking the sea. There was a lot of work that went into recreating original detailing, including this steel stair that had to be fully rebuilt, but back to the original details of it. In other places, we fairly liberally took license with adding entirely new kind of geometries and materials into the project. Here, the metal guardrail, handrail, was original, although rebuilt, and the terrazzo stair and all of the millwork was entirely new. It was a much darker original wood in the project. And here the stair did exist where it was, but it faced another direction, so we sheared it and revealed the cut to the concrete here. A detail of that stair, where the new millwork allows the stair to change directions. It used to sort of dogleg in the other direction, but we turned it this way into a new living room space. This is one of the cuts through the original basement concrete wall, and then a new kitchen that we built beyond, where we're matching the exposed board form concrete of the original, but adding very new materials like perforated aluminum and pink tile and pink terrazzo on the floor. Detail of the original arch refurbished, but with all new windows, double pane windows. This is a view on the upper floor. At the kind of distance there, you can see one of the original brick walls that we cut and left kind of revealed in its kind of rubbly form where it was cut. This is the view through one of the upstairs barrel vaults to the sea, all new custom furniture inside, a new fireplace. There had been a fireplace there, but they had been essentially dividing the two rooms more significantly. Framed views, this from a bedroom out to the sea in the new wing of the building, which sort of feels, I think, similar to the original building. Okay, final project. The map is the territory. This is the austere marina, which is about an hour south of Athens. We just completed this past summer. Here we designed the landscape and the public realm. It's a unique, this is the site. It's on this peninsula called the Vuliagmeni Peninsula. It's a unique challenge to design a landscape where there is currently no land. One way of thinking about this is that it's a blank site, a kind of void, a map with nothing on it, tabula rasa. But of course, this isn't the case. The sea and the seabed are a complex landform themselves, just hidden from view. So we started by looking at ways of representing this sea landscape, the nautical charts and maps that try to represent this land that is both above and below the waterline, showing the elevation of the seabed, the depth of the water, and the height of the land. We were inspired by the aesthetic of contours, traces of the land projected onto a 2D surface, and the relationship between representation and reality, 2D and perspectival view. This was the existing marina. The new marina doubles this in size and significantly expands it out into the water. So there was some land on the site, but that wasn't always the case. We started by looking back at the history. We found this aerial photography of the site taken at the end of World War II, where we see the natural shape of the site with its beaches and coves and a couple of small islands. We found this pretty exciting, this history of the landscape before the current marina, and wanted to try and tell the geologic story of this site in our design. So we tried to understand this original condition by overlaying a global north-south grid. And we uncovered old nautical maps that showed the underwater contours of the original site. And then we overlaid the site that we were given by the marine engineers for the project. This is the new land. This shape is obviously a response to different forces, the logistics of yacht movement and the economies of mooring spaces, along with the need to resist winds and waves. We were interested in the overlap of the history of the site with these new logics. So we projected the historic contours of the site onto this new flat site of the marina ground. The historic islands and coves become graphic tangles of lines projected onto the site. The new marina logic has its own local grid, the orientation of the central rectangular basin. So we overlaid the local with the global, creating a 2-meter locally oriented grid across the entire site. And next we created our own islands on the site, barriers between the water's edge and the cars on the site, but shaped like tiny new artificial islands. And that's how we generated the main concept for the landscape design. It's a giant map of the history of the site, literally drawn into the hardscape. Here we're reminded of the Borges short story on the exactitude of science, where he imagines a physical map that attempts to be so accurate that it coincides point for point with it. It's a map that is as accurate as the reality it represents. The map is the territory. Of course, there are lots of other motivations for the project. It emerges out of the local history of the resorts on this peninsula, its archaeology, the local plant and animal species, but it's also inherently global in its ambitions. And the local global simultaneity is reflected in the geometry of our design as well. This was a drawing that tried to overlay all of those competing kind of inputs and forces that shaped our design. So the primary elements of the project are therefore these. There's an orientating grid, the one-to-one drawing of the historic contours, new green islands scattered across the site, and then a new inhabitable retaining wall that reshapes the existing landscape at the back wall, the back of the site. Zooming in those same elements, the project has a new ground composed of 3 systems: grid, contour, and islands. And a bit more about each of those. So there's this orientating grid, which is shifted 23 degrees off of north around the central basin. Although it's spread across the entire site, we created a hierarchy of materials from expensive to economical: fine-cut basalt, Portuguese pavers, and two-toned asphalt. These are some mock-ups of attempting to create a kind of checkerboard grid, this 2 meter by 2 meter grid that had a certain fuzziness to it. This is an installation shot of the Portuguese paver sets on site, the beach literally revealed beneath the road, and some images of the grid as it maintains its orientation at points beyond the central basin, reminding visitors of the location relative to that local grid. Here's the one-to-one drawing happening in real time as the guys out on site try to trace out this 2 meter grid. That's the two-tone asphalt. These are the historic contours. We had the architect Piccionis in mind, and the way he reused found marble from neoclassical homes around archaeology sites in central Athens in his archaeological path. And so similarly, we tried to use existing marble stones, and we were interested in the interaction of the contours with the grid and other landscape features. These are we worked with a local quarry to take some of their marble offcuts onto the site and arrange them casually on site into these contour lines. These are some mock-ups on site as we start to test out what we received with what we wanted to produce, setting out certain compositional rules and cutting through the Portuguese pavers and the basalt grid. It also found its way onto the roof. There were buildings here as well. We didn't design the buildings. Another architect did the architecture. We were just the landscape designers. But in this particular project, that was pretty widespread. But our landscape also, this pattern spread onto the roof of the buildings as well. And the grid taking the form of an alternating green and gravel patch, and the contours as well. The planted islands, when we started the project, we took a look at a lot of other marinas. We had never designed a marina before. And we were struck by how harsh of an environment they typically are, especially the space directly behind the boats, which is largely an infrastructural space more than a public realm. It's mostly concrete, filled with cars and power connections. Instead of this, we proposed moving the primary car locations to the back of the site, behind a green buffer, creating a shared pedestrian surface at the water's edge. These are the interaction of those different systems then in the kind of design stage. These are some of the construction drawings of all of those systems coming together. And here the mounds being constructed on site, this kind of new artificial topography, now with life, however artificial. And at the back of the site, closer to the existing, there's a hotel kind of behind the marina, closer to that and navigating this 6 meter change of elevation. There need to be a retaining wall, but instead of making a flat retaining wall, we wanted to create terraces, inhabitable spaces for new and existing plants to flourish. We looked at historic agricultural stone walls from the Greek islands as references. And here's a section that cuts through that back area. It's made out of gabions with stone taken from the excavation of the buildings on site. We organized them with small at the bottom, up to large at the top. We proposed different rock size, which were stratified to create different size microenvironments to support a range of local bug and animal life. And here are those gabion walls as of a few weeks ago, with life in them. These are some drawings we did to kind of capture the full extent of all of the scope we were doing. Yeah, those white things in the middle are the buildings, which we left out. And then this is the making of the new ground. There's a certain surrealism in the making of it as these giant concrete blocks get loaded into the ground and then dirt comes in on top of them. So landscaping the very artificial ground, and the sheer labor and optimism of this whole endeavor was pretty striking. And here's the project completed from above. This is some drone photography. A zoom in of how all of these systems come together with those contour lines and the 2-meter grid, the green islands, plan view. Out at the windward pier, and some details of that separation between the back asphalt driving area and the front water's edge with boats. Looking through these fast. We also had, there was a big parking garage and we wanted to plant on top of it, so we created these tree mounds that, rather than being in planters, sort of peel up out of the pavers. The water's edge. This is another view of that gabion wall. And that's the overall view. So 6 projects, just to recap, that each in their own way generate alternate descriptions of their historic and contemporary condition, a projective atlas of obsessions at the Venice Biennale, a surreal, exquisite corpse office building, a seductive infrastructural iceberg, a precarious reflection of a small London garden, a house that collages new with old, and an inhabitable map of the territory. In our practice, we are convinced that design is a form of mapping. We must look closely at our surroundings, from up close, from inside, from a bird's eye view, and from far away. Only in this way can we find our position, and only in this way can we understand our local patch of soil as simultaneously also the entire world. One very small postscript, I know we're out of time, but this is in the form of a small map that we made recently that looked at the intrinsic ties between the local and the global. It takes approximately 2 to 4 weeks for the weather, for the massive air that circles around our local condition to circle the globe from west to east and return to our current condition. Obviously, that's formed up of complex interactions of the sun and the moon and ocean evaporation. But the local is inextricably tied to the global, and I think we're constantly reminded of that, particularly with the idea of weather, where the thick, soupy stratum of molecules that we occupy, the air around us, the spatial territory of our everyday, is both specific and contingent, particular and universal. So this drawing we did closely observes the weather in our backyard in London over 28 days, or approximately the time it takes for our local weather to circle the globe and return to us. Images were taken from the same location each hour, from midnight at the left till 11 p.m. at the right column, and each row is a different day. So the weather in our backyard departed us at the top left of the map, circled the globe, and returns to us at the bottom right a few weeks later. Close observation of the local as a way of better understanding our position in the world. Thanks.
We thank you so much. We don't have too much time for questions, but I do want to be able to discuss it. I've been finding many of these talks so enriching because they give us an opportunity to learn a little bit more intimately what drives some of the design process and how architects are looking at things. It strikes me, the other thing that's very interesting about the whole series in general is that we don't overly my understanding is that Ryan and Tilo, you didn't speak beforehand, and so you're kind of also seeing each other's work at the same at this very moment unfolded before. So I think that's also very interesting, and in some ways, I it's hard not to imagine that we actually curated this very, very deliberately because the way I'm looking at the types of work that you're both showing, it feels to me, and I'm trying to formulate this, so forgive me as I try to work it out in my head and speak the question at the same time. Your educational backgrounds seem to be very present in the way that you're working, and maybe the way that I can imagine speaking about this or thinking about it a little bit more clearly, especially in the context of an academic institution here. Tilo, your work is coming, it's a kind of meditation on a particular type, and with each project that you shared, both starting very back in terms of the origin of those housing projects that you were looking at and moving forward now into the future, each one is a kind of meditation on housing in its most rational form and in the way in which, let's say, composition is played out by virtue of interior relationships, flexibility, the communal aspects. I mean, I see a very clear trajectory of trying to build on that lineage, and you're looking actually at the architecture that was produced in Basel, 100 years ago, and just seeing that kind of trajectory and seeing yourself as part of that trajectory in housing. And then what's interesting, then, Ryan, I'm looking at the work that you're producing, and there's each project has a very strong metaphorical, conceptually driven. They're all very different, first of all, I'm sure you're showing us very deliberately different things across the 6 projects that you shared, but there was always a kind of conceptual metaphor that seemed to be both necessary or at the origin of the project. So maybe in some ways one could say it's more mannerist in that way, in the sense that perhaps it relies or requires a kind of metaphorical or conceptual, whether it's an art piece or whether it's the alternative structural diagram or this cartographic mapping graphically onto the marina. And so there was always a kind of, I wonder if you both could tell us, now that images are gone, talk to us about the motivations of because again, these seem to be very distinct and in some ways almost in my mind represent a kind of European educational system and one that here in America. So maybe that's wrong-headed, but I'd love for you to refute or conjecture.
Do you want?
Is that fair?
I can jump in and just respond a little bit. Each project is very different. Each project, some of them start from kind of maybe collected metaphors or collective kind of concepts. None of them started from those specific ones. It's not nearly that linear. I mean, a lot of those get overlaid or post-rationalized onto a project. But I think the key is that we are always starting a project by looking very carefully at the existing, which I was trying to say is that how broadly defined that existing is, that it's not just the kind of extent of the site or the surrounding context in the kind of typical sense of what that context is, but it's the context of our own kind of obsessions and passions at any moment as well, and the kind of collections of interests that we have along the way. And those become productive as ways of helping us to then make sense of our instincts, sometimes after the fact, sometimes during the fact, as drivers of what we're doing. And I do think that that's partly coming out of a certain pedagogical system that allows us to explore ways of working through the diagram or through kind of found observations.
Yeah. What I've shown was really very linear, but this is also like one part of our work. But I was really kind of intrigued because you showed something which I thought was very similar to what we do. You showed like a map, and you said like every project you do is also like reusing things of other projects. And I mean, this was exactly the same what we do, and I think this is it's also clear, but that we try to make this really systematic, and obviously you as well. So even if there is like what we show now is very different, but there maybe are common positions we would not have expected.
What are those common positions that you?
So that like have this kind of reuse or digest, rethink things you did, because maybe you when you start a project, you have a very close look to the site, you have a very close look to the history of the site, you have a maybe very close look to the cultural surroundings, if wherever it is, even if it's in Switzerland, it's completely different if it's in Biel or in Basel or in Zurich. And then out of that, you try to take pieces and form them into something which makes sense for the moment and hopefully for the future. And then there is maybe one thing which is more continuous, like coming out of the office where you have the experience, and maybe like working on a floor plan for housing. This is very so specific that you like 5 centimeters here, 5 centimeters there makes the difference that something works or it doesn't work. And other things, like in a conceptual way, they're just much more open and maybe more defined by restraints you have to fulfill.
I'm going to open it up very immediately to all of you because, again, I don't want to run out of time. I have other questions, though, if you...
Thanks for sharing. I was struck by the contrast as well in process and technique, but it's also multiplied because you're each in a partnership, right? So you're working in multiples already. And so you showed us 2 different versions, but there's potentially 10 different versions, 12 different versions. Tilo, you started talking about the difference between your partners, and I know all 3 partners, and so I can sort of visualize those. Ryan, could you also tell us a little bit about who's the poet in the relationship, who's the collage maker, who brings these wonderful images together? Like they're both multipled, so maybe tell us about the workings of the partnerships that we haven't seen the hidden partners present today.
And I'll just add to that, when you showed the picture of the 3 of you, I was thinking, hippie, businessman, dad. I don't know. And then I was thinking, and Ryan, you didn't show Christina, but I'm thinking, Ryan and better half. I'm just kidding. Anyway, please, that's a great question. Tell me about the practice.
It's exactly like that, and I think we just the 3 of us, or the 4 of us, also with Mariana, we are so different, but together we form something which is again better than the pieces. So the whole is hopefully better than the pieces, and so I think collaboration is so important, and we were always since the beginning we tried to work on a project and really dig in there and discuss all around the project, and then all these influences come, and they must be overwhelming or autocratic or whatever. It's always related to a project, and then it makes sense or it doesn't make sense. But if it's such a rich diversity of people, and you work on something, then you really make a next step.
I want to know specifics. Who's the plan maker? Who's the storyteller? Who's the code expert? Tell me who's got the superpowers in which area. You're the plan maker.
Yes, I'm. But for sure. I'm very much interested in construction, and I think I have certain abilities, which makes for me easy to have to think about construction, to think about structure, to think about the organization of things, and maybe I'm completely blind when it goes to having an image of something. But then the other 2 come in, or the other 3 come in, and then we discuss, and then the other thing is the most productive ways are the misunderstandings among us. So we discuss, and I completely misunderstand what they tell. I go and work, and I come back, and then maybe they think, now it has taken a twist, which is deliberately much more free than we thought, and then and the other way around, that they misunderstand me, and I think, I was so kind of limited in my imagination to think in that way. But if you see it and it's there then you think, now it's interesting and it's better than what I thought, and then you can just let loose your thoughts.
Yeah, quickly. Christine and I are obviously different people, and we bring different skills to the partnership. But surprisingly, we're very aligned on a lot of things, and maybe part of that's coming out of the similar kind of schooling. We kind of came of age through architecture together. We've worked at some of the same offices globally, and we've been, critiquing and advising each other for a very long time. So there's a certain, kind of naturalism in the way that we just kind of build ideas off of each other, and oftentimes those are fairly aligned, so kind of surprisingly. Christina is a very good critic. She's a very tough editor, and I think that's her real superpower, is that she's very clear and tough when she knows that she doesn't like something. And I sometimes sugarcoat it more than that, but but she's a good critic.
But collaborations, it's not only among us. collaboration is also like opening the office to other people, integrate other things, and really to listen what other people tell you, and with that understanding, try to push a project. So we are, at least we are not an office capable just like to close off in the office and then have good results. We have to be open and try to get influences from wherever we can.
Hi. I noticed a certain aesthetic and material and sort of palette considerations that's unique to each of you. Tilo, the sort of gray, I don't know if it's concrete, shows up again and again. And then Ryan, there's a kind of heterodox multicolor collage quality. And I'm curious for each of you whether that's on some level a position or whether it's simply an aesthetic preference.
No. Okay, I mean, with the concrete, it started as an aesthetics, but also once we did a small booklet called Unfinished, and this was like the idea that everything is just like part of a story, which has a past, which has a present, which are normally we as an architect with a project, and which has a future. And this unfinished is something like in the present and will be finished in the future. And so we tried also to make, also like of cost reason, something which is reduced to the natural material. There is like no one else coming to paint or whatever. It's just like it's done and finished and paid. And then like the next generation maybe, they will start to paint things or just taking over. And I think this is completely okay. So we don't think that everything must be kind of finished when we hand over. It can also be like in the intermediate state and someone else then taking over. And at the moment we handed in the competition, and it's always like about if you make a wood construction because of sustainability or concrete, and for cost reasons normally it ends always in concrete. So what we did, we said we tried to make everything as slim as possible. So also no added material, so no gypsum, which has like a lot of CO2, but everything is just the slimmest possible thing. So slimmest possible concrete ceiling, but then if you paint it, you have like the slimmest possible treatment of a surface. So it's also like you think, what would you like to control, and how can you control it in a way or in a manner that you don't spoil material.
Each project's a little bit different, and I think we try to really take that seriously. I do think that the context of Athens has influenced our sense of color and kind of texture quite a bit, and maybe brought a bit more color into some of our UK projects as well. I think we were pretty monochromatic when we started the practice just working in London for a while, and I think we're more open to color and texture, having worked in Greece a bit. But it's totally dependent on the project, I would say.
Thank you very much, both of you. Really appreciate it.